Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Diverse Talk Matters.
To talk about different things around diversity, equity, inclusion, talk about things that people may find challenges with, so we hope you find them really useful. Some are around people's different lived experiences, some really challenging conversation, things that sometimes we don't need to talk about. But we really hope you enjoy the range of topics that we are introducing to you or bringing to you, to your homes, to your house, to your workplaces.
We hope you enjoy. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Diverse Talk Matters. I'm Natasha Broomfield-Reid, the founder director of Diverse Matters, and I've got a wonderful guest, another one today. It is Simon Croft from Gendered Intelligence. Hi Simon.
Good morning, lovely to be here.
Excellent. Now today, I've wanted to get you on for a little while, Simon, because I think it's really important that we talk about trans inclusion, and that's what the whole podcast is about today. But first, tell me a little bit about the organisation Gendered Intelligence, what they do, how people can get support, and just so to set the scene of your organisation and your background.
Brilliant. Yeah, really happy to do that. Thank you. So Gendered Intelligence is a registered charity. We were established back in 2008, and our aims are to expand understandings of gender and to improve trans people's lives. So we basically imagine a world where there are many different gender identities, many different gender expressions, that they're all visible, they're all valued, and where trans and non-binary and gender questioning people can live healthy and safe and fulfilled lives. So in terms of the work that we do, we offer a range of different things. So we offer services directly for trans, non-binary and gender questioning people. We also deliver education, training, consultancy services to help organisations to improve their inclusive practices. So we can support places with their policy, with their guidance writing, with questions they may have, all of that sort of thing. And we also have a small department which also works to influence legislation, the media, policy, and research at a national level. So in terms of kind of a bit more about us, we are a trans-led and trans-involving organisation. So around about 90% of our staff are trans or non-binary identified, myself included, and also including all of our frontline training staff too. I've been around Gendered Intelligence in one way, shape or form pretty much since it started back in 2008. But really my main involvement started in late 2013 when I was asked to crystallise a training department for the first time. And since then, that department's grown. We now have 8 people working for us in that department, and we've trained well over 50,000 people across more than 2,500 live sessions. And we train right across the whole public, private and not-for-profit sectors. And there are fairly few sectors that we haven't worked in one way, shape or form. Also, we trained all of Stonewall staff when Stonewall made that move a number of years ago to become trans-inclusive, and they still commission us to train their new starters today. So back in the day, I used to do loads of training myself. Now, I don't do frontline training myself, although I must confess I do miss it a little bit, but I do still do consultancy for organisations. I have quite a lot of client contact that way.
That's brilliant. That's so good to hear. And interesting that you also supported Stonewall. I wasn't aware of that because, like you said, when they expanded their work to support trans people, I didn't realise you helped. That's brilliant. Okay. Now, as you know, we've known each other a little while, and sometimes we talk about this and say, when it comes to trans inclusion, sadly, this is an area where there's a lot of challenge, there's a lot of discrimination. A lot of people don't understand people who want to transition. So what challenges have you faced in advocating for trans rights? And how have you sort of navigated those?
That's a really interesting question, I think. And it's something that's changed a lot over that period of time in which we've been working. So initially, I would say in many ways, there were actually really relatively few challenges. There was a lot of work to do. There was a lot to improve around trans inclusion in everything from healthcare to education to housing, you name it. And that work is still there. But it actually wasn't that hard to advocate for that, because where we were that people often realised they didn't know very much. They were keen to know a bit more. They approached the subject with an open mind and were by and large, just decent people who are keen to understand and be a bit more inclusive. And I think a lot about trans inclusion isn't rocket science, and people just saw some fairly straightforward, positive, kind, practical actions that they could take, and they got on with it. But I think the big change in recent years, as you were alluding to there, is that we've experienced an awful lot of negativity from some very vocal individuals, some very vocal groups. There's been an awful lot in the media. A great deal of that hasn't been very positive. I think, what we're hearing from is a group of people who are actually keen to roll back the rights of many minoritized and marginalized individuals, not just trans folks. We're not distinct in that regard. And I think, it's sad to me, because I think that people are trying to maintain privilege and norms which benefit themselves in particular ways. But actually, when we dig into those norms, that they aren't actually very good for anyone. I think, there's a lot of things that we can do. And so I think I would draw parallels here to many other kinds of inclusion and recognize that a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is it's old recycled narratives that are circulating, things like it's old sexism, it's old homophobia. There's nothing very new here. But I wish I actually had a better answer at the moment for how we are navigating those challenges.
Yeah.
Because I think it's actually really, really hard at the moment. We act in good faith the whole time. But it just doesn't seem to be enough. Our resources are limited. Our commitment might not be, but our resources are limited. And it's a challenge to get our voices platformed and heard and understood. We struggle with that. We want to work with responsible journalists, but column inches as a result of that still remain pretty low. There's not a huge amount getting platformed. So this kind of thing is a really positive opportunity for us, and I'm really pleased to be here, and hoping that quite a wide spectrum of people will listen. I think in terms of other things, I think it's a challenge for us to be recognised as expert in our own lives. Again, that's something that many groups of people have struggled with over the years. Lived experience and professional expertise now seem to be getting labelled as bias in ways where trans people are concerned. So I think it's quite a challenge to get that good, accurate information and critical thinking out there to replace some of this misinformation and negativity.
Yeah.
And I think it takes time to engage people with that thinking as well, because I think sometimes there are folks who are just kind of reactivating hackneyed old stereotypes and fears and things like that. And actually, in many ways, that's quite easy to do. It doesn't take long to do. But when you want to be doing something more positive and asking people maybe to think again or to question some received wisdom, that's a bigger ask, and it takes longer. So that's not a 5-minute job.
Because one of the things that you hear a lot is this ideology about sex versus gender, and people say, well, if somebody's transitioned, they can't experience the same challenges that somebody's had from birth, etc. And safe spaces. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think to sort of think about that is to think about all people within a group as being just very homogenous, and all very much the same. And of course, any group of people can be having very, very different experiences. There will be more differences between two cisgender women, potentially from different cultures, perhaps, than there would be perhaps from a cis woman and trans woman from a similar culture. So I think that nobody's saying that trans women and cis women have exactly the same experiences in their lives, but then no women have exactly the same experiences. And I think that what our perspective is that when you bring those different experiences together, you actually increase the richness of the conversations, you increase the perspectives that are being brought to those important conversations, and actually you're able to triangulate more effectively what some of those real nuggets of the things are that we really need to be addressing. All women suffer under patriarchy in the current circumstances. So I think there is just so much more that brings people together than there is that separates us. So yes, I think that that's my starting point, and I think sometimes
understand that, and I wish more people felt like that, because sadly, you go in the media and anybody's writing about trying, and like you said, it can happen with all aspects of inclusion. Somebody puts something in the media, or somebody writes something that's positive, and then somebody else writes, here we go, wokery, negative, and then brings in different discussions about it. So no, I totally hear what you're saying. Again, these things and just because I think this is what people want to hear, is that again we hear negative and negative perceptions about trans people, about sport. In terms of they're competing in different levels of sport, transitioned and not. And there's been a lot of backlash, even when people weren't trans as well, as you know. So what are your thoughts about trans people in sport?
I think, trans people, like all people, should have a place in sport. When you read the International Olympic Committee information, one of their statements is that the practice of sport is a human right. And I think that, when we're talking about grassroots level, again, there are so many and diverse different advantages and disadvantages that individuals have competing at grassroots level. And some of them are to do with, physicality. Some of them are to do with how they approach things in terms mentally. Some of them are to do with coaching. Some of them to do with nutrition. All of those different things. Just pure ability to access certainly kinds of sport financially. So I think there are huge differences at grassroots level. And really, whether somebody is trans or not is just one of those differences. It's part of that picture. And that's aside from any arguments around whether certain people might have retained advantage or disadvantage in any way. So I think at grassroots level, the main factor is inclusion and making sure that everybody has that opportunity to participate and to benefit from all of the many different experiences that the sport offers. I was on a panel recently with the director of human rights for the International Olympic Committee. And she was very much taking that position as well and saying, that's moved towards the inclusion end of things when you're at grassroots. I think when we're talking about elite sport, where very small differences in terms of performance can make very, very large differences in terms of success and reward and things like that, we perhaps need to look at things a little bit differently. And I think what we are seeing at the moment is that people are taking some very incomplete information and extrapolating it in ways which aren't helpful, and that nobody knows the answer at the moment. For every paper that's out there that's saying, well, this isn't happening, another paper will be out there saying, well, this is happening, or whatever it is. And I think that's simply where we are, is we don't have very good information at the moment. And so what we really need to do is for national governing bodies, for international bodies, to be turning into actually doing proper, meaningful research, but also questioning themselves as to what they're looking for, how they're looking for it, how they're accessing the subjects of study, all of those sorts of things as well. And as regards sport, we've done a lot of critical thinking at Gendered Intelligence, and we've developed a suite of documents, and now all up on our website. So there's one on grassroots sport for, if you're a club or someone local wants to do a little bit of thinking there. There's one that covers, I think I called it Key Questions, Considerations and a Framework for Elite Sport, which is, it doesn't tell anybody what to think, but it does ask that people do think and think critically and think about challenging stereotypes and those sorts of things. So that's there. There's also a legal analysis, which was developed for us by a law firm. And there's also a report full of quotes, which is illustrating trans people's actual experiences in sports and what that looks like. And some of those quotes are really positive, and it shows that trans inclusion in sport is very doable. And quite a few of those quotes are quite negative, and they're, showing poor experiences. And you look at some of them and you think that is quite easy to fix. So I think those are key points that I would make, is like inclusion at grassroots. Let's do some thinking at elite sport, but we should not be excluding people from sport without a very, very good reason for doing so. And we're open to those discussions. I think for me, the other thing that happens is this sort of backlash against individuals. And I think that is just completely unacceptable, because if someone's complying with a sports policy, whatever that is, regarding trans people competing, well, that's an end of it on an individual level. And that person's privacy should be respected, their personal situation, their medical history, all of those things. They're not for public discussion. They're not for public scrutiny. So whatever somebody thinks about trans inclusion in sport, that should never result in trolling, antagonism, abuse. We do see that online towards participants who are trans or thought to be trans. And there are quite a few examples of cis people being abused for being trans when they're not. If people have got an issue with the policy, that's fine, but you take it up with the governing body. You don't take it out on individuals. And if you do, you should be held to account for that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, gosh, I've had so many debates, or should I say arguments, with people, and I think they are following the rules. Why you like you say, attacking that person? If you have an issue, go to where the decision, has been made, And those decisions should have been thought through carefully. Like you said, there's probably a bit more research needs to be done for the high level of elite sport. But absolutely, they are following the rules. They're not going in there telling any fibs. They're not going in there doing things they shouldn't be doing. And again, the backlash and the hate is horrible. It's absolutely disgusting. And I often say to people, because sometimes people say to me, oh, all we hear about is trans inclusion, trans. Well, and I'm like, yes, you do know that trans people have been here for centuries, don't you? Because people have this perception that trans inclusion and trans people are a new thing, and that they actually haven't been around for centuries, and it's something that's, and I think, do your reading, do you, look up do a bit of history here. This isn't something new that people are now just, thinking, this idea they want to transition. It's been happening for years, and it really, really just wind me up a little bit. It's something that, insane to you. I don't know if you do anything about that when you do training about the sort of background and the history that, we've been here for ages, thank you.
We tend to mention it in passing, but to be honest, our training is much more focused on practical inclusion in the here and now. Yes, we could certainly do an amazing history session, but that's perhaps a little bit outside what the workplace needs. But I think, I think one of the things is that the word is quite new, or newer, but the life experience of differences around gender and indeed, variation of sex characteristics is absolutely not new. You've got to look a little bit to understand and find those people who may have some synergy or similar experiences to people that we might nowadays call trans or non-binary or etc. But they are there. They're there in all the old texts. You can find them. That history is there.
Yeah. And also, you make up on your training, and we talk a lot about it. It's in other areas of inclusion around intersectionality, and the fact that when we talk about anyone, including trans people, we must talk about whether it's people from a black or racialized community, disabled trans people, because their experience may be different to others. Do you ever what do you do around intersectionality?
Yeah, we definitely include it in all of our sessions. And it's one of the core pillars of our new 5-year strategy, which runs from mid this year to mid 2029. So, for example, we know that trans women, trans feminine people experience trans misogyny, and that's a huge issue. And a lot of kind of the narratives that we've spoken about or alluded to, a lot of the media narratives, a lot of the sport narratives, they're very, very much centered on trans women. We also know that the Black trans community in particular is experiencing very high levels of violence, high levels of abuse, high levels of mental ill health, especially Black trans women who experience that really intense combination of sexism and racism and transphobia, sometimes called trans misogynoir. We know that trans people disproportionately have disabilities and or might be neurodivergent, for example. I mentioned at the start that our staff cohort is around about 90% trans. But when we did our last staff survey, it was also showing us that we are a majority disabled organisation as well, and virtually all LGBTQ plus as well. So we are inherently a kind of an intersectional organisation in that way. And of course, there are also intersections, as you mentioned, with faith and class, or being a parent and carer, your levels of household income, all of those sorts of things. So we touch on it as a concept when we're training, but we also try and make sure that when we provide scenarios to work with, which might have examples and things like that in them, we are inherently bringing in an intersectional approach to that. So it's not just a one-dimensional example, where we find people will often make inherent assumptions that if we're talking about a trans person, that they're also white and able-bodied and this and that and the other. And so we bring other things in, and it brings that other dimension, and really makes people think a little bit more about, okay, so what's happening for this person, and there are plenty of examples that sit around that as well. And I think, there are a lot of challenges around that, because I think that the most marginalized frequently and understandably have the least spare capacity to be part of initiatives, particularly, including in the workplace and things like that. The emotional labor can be absolutely immense.
No, definitely. Thanks for that. What about, we do a lot of work with employers like yourself. You work with all different types of people. And often people are maybe only just starting their journey in supporting trans people, trans non-binary people, for example. What is your experience of supporting employees around trans inclusion? And what good practice would you say that people should have as a minimum?
I think top of the list is education. If you feel that quite often, I think people haven't started because they don't quite know where to start or how to start, and they lack confidence in their understandings and things like that. So I think if you start with some basic education, that can be organised training, like the kind of services that we offer. It could be storytelling also from individuals with lived experience. It can be making sure you've got articles and things like that are on the company intranet, but ideally ones chosen by trans and non-binary people themselves, so that there is some kind of a check on recognising that those do in fact speak to actual trans lives. And ideally really a combination of those things, because they all bring a different kind of perspective or approach and a different way to learn, because people learn in different ways as well. Then I would say, once people have got a grasp of the basics, have a little bit more confidence to step into that area, understand the need and understand the lived experience, they're generally supportive of work to improve inclusion. And so then I would say, well, that's the point at which you can start thinking about maybe getting some policy in place and crucially implement it. I'm sure you've come across plenty of situations where people have written something and it stays on the shelf, but actually that's not where it's going to do its work. So it's about implementing it. So one of the things that we offer is a trans and non-binary at work policy toolkit. That's free on request. You can go to our website or indeed email me, and we can sort that out. And what it does is it gives people a bit of an outline of things to consider, some questions to think about, some chunks of sample text that can give them a bit of a starting point, so they're not starting with a completely blank page. It includes the common things, like you mentioned, like transition at work, and also stuff like managing language, which people often struggle with, bit of a hotspot, bit of a worry. Access to toilets, that always comes up still, those sorts of things.
Every time.
Every time. We did a conference a while back, and there was a session in it called Not Another Talk About Toilets. But anyway, but it also includes some of the things that people often don't think about. So things like overseas travel. And what about overseas travel where you might be asking a trans employee to travel, but you don't even know they're trans? What do you do in those circumstances? Can people even carry the medications that they need? Is it legal to import them in that country? Is it safe in that country? All of those sorts of things. Things like trans-positive recruitment processes, thinking about special medical leave, thinking about whether your employee assistance scheme has trans-knowledgeable counsellors, all of those sorts of things. So there's all of those kinds of things which it brings to the table. It's not intended that you bring everything to do with trans people into one single policy and kind of hive it off as some sort of really special thing. But in many instances, it's a bit of a prompt to look at all people's other policies and ensure they're inclusive as well. Yeah, so I think those are the two things to get started. And then there's so much more that could be done, supporting employee resource groups and all kinds of other things.
And it's always ongoing, isn't it? I always say to people, start on one thing and develop it and go on. You don't have to do everything all in one go. And like you say, bring people on board, education, like you said. And when you said language, I can probably say any time, and not just about trans inclusion, but often about LGBT plus inclusion. People are, I don't know, the terminology's changed, I don't know. And and I'm sure you would say the same thing. It's about, yes, educating yourself, but if you make a mistake, modify, change it and do better next time. We're all going to make mistakes, and you want to build a culture where it's okay to make a mistake. It's different with somebody, misgendering somebody on purpose and doing it in a, purposefully horrible way, to somebody maybe making a mistake and then they rectify that mistake. And I think, people sometimes get caught up in language. You don't have to know everything. At the end of the day, I'm sure you'd say the same thing. Be led by the person in front of you and how they describe themselves. That's the easiest thing. Communicate and find out. And I think sometimes people have got this fear of, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do.
I would absolutely agree. And we thought about this quite a lot a few years ago, and how we address language in training. It's all designed to give people some confidence. So absolutely, we have the bit about, if you make a mistake, just apologize briefly, move on, aim to do better next time. don't over apologize, because it starts making it all about us when we've made a mistake. And I'm not immune. Even I work in this area as a day job. Nobody is immune to the odd mistake here or there. That's human. But I think that there are an awful lot of terms that people worry about, which may be, if you like, are kind of descriptive terms about someone's identity. And there's literally hundreds of those. And I think quite often people think, oh, I've got to understand all of these. It's like, no, you don't. You do not need to turn yourself into a walking glossary. In fact, that will probably be quite unhelpful in many ways. And so what we say is we divide language up into kind of three categories. So the first category is the language that you use every day. So what you need to interact with a person in front of you, which is usually their name, their pronoun, if you're going to be mentioning them later on, those sorts of things. And just getting those right. And that's pretty straightforward. We're used to doing it with names all the time. We don't kind of decide half the world is called Fred and the other half is called Ethel and just sort of behave in that way. We ask someone's name and do our best to remember it. And if we've forgotten, next time we meet, and go, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I've forgotten your name. Please, could you remind me? And we can do the same things with other kinds of language. Then we say there's the descriptive language. What we would say there is it's important to understand the different kinds of experience that trans people might have. So people who might have a distinct identity as a man or a woman, just not the one that people assume that they would have when they were born. Having a non-binary identity, so something other, outside, between, beyond those identities of man and woman. The experience of having a gender which isn't fixed, which is more fluid, and possibly the experience of not having a sense of gender at all in that regard. So those are the kinds of types of experience that we talk about. And yes, there is some language we can use generally to describe that. But most of the time, you don't need to know exactly how somebody describes their identity in terms of terminology. And if it does come up, just turn into the conversation. So, maybe I haven't heard that term before. Could you explain what that means for you? And then usually they'll be using it in a context where actually you can have that kind of conversation. So there's that. And then we would say actually there are perhaps half a dozen, 6 or 8 terms which actually you do need to learn and understand. Words like trans, non-binary, those kinds of terms, gender identity, gender expression, and just to understand those. But if it's only 6 or 8 terms, they're pretty straightforward to get to grips with. And these are the terms that enable us to have those productive and positive conversations. So we work on that basis, sort of demystifying, building confidence. And I think it's pretty straightforward.
Totally. And I think anybody listening, please listen to what Simon's saying. We say the same thing in our training about inclusion led broadly. Don't get sort of stuck and fight that fear, because it's not as bad as you think, honestly. We don't expect you to know everything. I love when you said you're not expected to be a walking dictionary. Exactly. I mean, you're not. Please believe that. The other thing you mentioned was around making sure that if people got a helpline, an employee assistance helpline, that the people who are trans have awareness and the trans inclusive. And, I've heard of seen studies where, because that somebody's transitioning can be a very challenging time. It can be a time that, it's a major change. So in terms of, even getting a doctor, getting appointments, getting, support from families. So mental health is something, and I know you provide counselling as well as one of your services. Anything more to add around sort of counselling support, mental health for trans people that might be useful for people to listen here?
But yes, we don't directly provide a counselling service ourselves. What we do is we have a 2-day course for therapists and counsellors. We've had people fly in from other countries to attend that because it really is quite a key course that is not readily available elsewhere. And that, I think, really opens up people's minds. They find that very, very useful. Then once they've done that, if they are a qualified counsellor with major counselling body, then they can join our directory as well. So there's a directory on the Gendered Intelligence website, and you can look into that and find counsellors who, for example, are themselves trans and non-binary, or they may be from the wider LGBT community. We also encourage people to say if they are Black, people of colour, so that people can try and find counsellors with whom they may feel more synergy and comfortable in a space where they're just not having to explain things. And I think the value of having it's not to say that other counsellors can't help. Absolutely, they can. But we also do hear from quite a number of trans folk say, just being in a space with a counsellor who also shares that identity is just a whole different experience. It's a very, very different sort of thing. So I would say, that is a key thing. We're very keen to support counsellors to improve their practices, to understand what trans inclusive practice might be. And we've got a network for therapists and counsellors as well, which is open to the people who've done the course.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's good. Thank you. And also in health, I remember, we work with health providers, whether it's private, whether it's NHS. And it's interesting that, sadly, a lot of health professionals do not have trans-inclusive educational training or awareness. And you think, you might have somebody who's going in for treatment, for support, and you think, wow. And I think, and I know you do work with health providers, and I think, gosh, I just urge anybody who's working in health, if you haven't done any trans-inclusive education, it's really important. What are your thoughts on that, and what have you done with health providers?
Yes, I think we've worked with a range of health providers, and that can be anything from a clinical commissioning group back in the day to a local GP surgery to bigger organisations. We've done quite a lot of work with CAMS services, so children and adolescent mental health services, because obviously we do a lot of youth work. We have a lot of youth groups for young people, and so we have some considerable insights there, which are helpful in those circumstances. So I think, and we've also worked with certain settings where they are kind of closed settings or inpatient settings as well for people. So we've worked across a diversity of different healthcare settings, and I think also it's about not only about mental health, it's about physical healthcare. I think we come across situations where whatever a trans person presents with, it's something to do with them being trans. It's sometimes called the trans broken arm syndrome or trans cold. If you turn up with the cold or you've broken your arm, it's because you're trans. Like, no, it's nothing to do with that. Just treat my broken arm, sort of thing. And I think it is absolutely key that there should be, even if it's a short session, in the many years of training that doctors and nurses and other clinical professionals have. There should be something in there, and as you said, there's not, and it really, really does need to be in there with from the scratch, from day one.
Definitely. So whoever's out there listening to when people are doing their medical training, nursing training, whatever you're doing, private care, social care, please, because for everybody to get an equitable service, there needs to have that knowledge and awareness, and people would not, trans people don't want to go into health, you're in healthcare because you need help and support, whatever you're going through. You don't want to then have to deal with the challenges of people being transphobic or not knowing how to support you or how to talk to you, etc., etc. So it's really, I'd urge everybody out there now, please do that. And also in schools now, because there are now, thankfully, more sort of responsibilities on schools to make sure they address trans inclusion. And again, sometimes I'll have a very interesting discussion with people because they have this perception, this rhetoric out there that the schools are teaching people you've got to transition, and this whole perception of. But what, in my experience, they're teaching me that around there's different types of people in this world. It includes trans people. What are your thoughts on schools and what they can do?
Yeah, I think it's just going back to the basics, really. As you said, there's again quite a lot of misinformation about what schools are doing out there, and it is misinformation. I think the reality is, every adult in a child's life should be supporting them in a positive and open and non-judgmental way, and that is what enables them to thrive. So, I mean, at Gendered Intelligence, as I mentioned, we do a lot of professional youth work around trans, non-binary and gender questioning children. And I think, what we try and do is give young people spaces where they're supported and respected and listened to and heard in safety, where, there's some care and kindness, which sometimes can feel like it's lacking for our young people. A place, crucially, where they can express their worries and doubts and fears and questions without any judgment, without people suddenly saying, oh, well, that means then this isn't you, just because you've got a question about it or something. A place where they can explore themselves and express themselves freely without stereotypes, where being trans isn't positioned as some kind of an undesirable outcome, in inverted commas, that is going to displease or disappoint or burden the adults around them. Crucially, a place where they can be happy and make friends. These are all things that young people should be able to take for granted, all young people. So I think that's key. And I think, if schools are doing that, then the child is provided with an environment in which they can thrive, in which they can engage with school, in which they can learn. And so I would say that schools just should be focusing on their duty of care and taking that child-centered approach. People who are working in schools, whether they're teachers or school nurses or school counsellors or some other role, they bring their professional skills and knowledge and experience and expertise. They know what it means to support children and young people well. That is their day job. They know what good looks like. So I think that they should have confidence that all of this still applies when a child is trans or non-binary or gender questioning. I think sometimes people have been pushed into a position of such a lack of confidence, they feel a little bit unable to bring their skills to bear. But those are the things that we would say, is that all young people should be supported and respected in that way.
Definitely. And again, in the world of inclusion, including trans inclusion, there's been, rightfully so, the discussion around, and I will say the word active allyship, because are you an accomplice? Are you a conspirator? Are you there? Are you supporting trans people? Sometimes the term allyship is used and they're not really allies. It might be that performative allyship where they're saying one thing and doing another, or it's all for their own benefit. I don't mean any of that. But when we talk about true allyship, active allyship for trans people, what would you say to people that they could do to show they are demonstrating action in and being an active?
Yeah. I think the first thing actually is to make a commitment to educate yourself. And I think that really underpins allyship not being performative. So, for example, if you put your pronouns in your email footer, make sure you understand why it's important and also what it implicitly commits you to doing, which is respecting other people's pronouns. If you've got your pronouns showing in your email footer, but then when somebody says, oh, I use they, them pronouns, you continually misgender them, that's not okay. That's not allyship. If somebody says, well, that they use a less common pronoun like ze or per, for example, oh gosh, I've never heard that before, and you decide it's too hard, that's not okay. As we spoke about before, making a couple of mistakes in good faith and while you're getting the hang of it is one thing. Not being prepared to make the effort is another. So I think those things are key. And if you don't understand something, you're not sure, take those steps to educate yourself. That said, those small signs that show you're a safe pair of hands are so important. I think, we as trans folk can often feel very much on the back foot these days. We're unsure whether somebody is going to actually be quite hostile to us at times. So you're always looking for those little signs that say, actually, I'm okay here, I'm safe here, I'm welcome here. And when we're unsure who to trust, those things can really be lifelines. So it can also mean doing things like commenting positively around Trans History Month, or saying that you enjoyed a positive article. It can mean having a little trans or non-binary pin on your bag, or things like that. But I think it also means stepping up to question some of those behaviours which may be acting to exclude trans people and responding in support of trans inclusion. And I think there it's not about kind of taking that head knocking approach to it. It's maybe about stepping into that with some questions and saying, well, that's not the view I hold. Why do you hold that view? Where's that come from? Why are you thinking that way? Have you heard about how that can impact trans folks? And just sort of trying to engage a bit of conversation there, because you never know when there's a trans person around.
Exactly. And like I said, it's action in it. So like you said, speaking up, challenging, and you can challenge exactly how you just said in a positive way. It can be a conversation. It doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be acerbic. It can be in that way. And also things like if you're line managing, people, make sure people know you're inclusive to everybody. Put it in your, as an organisational strategy, put it in your plan around making sure that, you're including all aspects of inclusion and making sure it's done. Are you checking that the transitioning policy is working? Does it need updating? Do we need, if there's a trans inclusion or an LGBT network group, is it being resourced? Is it being support? things where people put the money where their mouth is and time where it is as well. Because, like I said, there's some really great ones you've done that are really quite, free, in terms of pronouns and respecting people, all that sort of thing. But also, I think employers need to actually do the other bits as well in terms of driving it forwards, because that's all great, but there needs to be action. And I always challenge people, and I'm sure you do the same. What actually you're going to do? What you're going to do after today to make sure you implement it fully. Because sometimes people will say, they're sort of minimal and then not really drive it forward. But no, all the stuff you said was brilliant. That sort of leads on to we've talked about this before we did the podcast. Trans remembrance coming up, trans awareness. You have LGBT History Month coming up early next year. What do you think, what do you say to those people who say, why have we got these awareness days? Which I think are a great way of educating, but what is your response to say, why should we have these days still?
Well, I think everybody has times and things that they want to celebrate, whether that's individual personal anniversaries or wider kind of things. And not necessarily everybody finds those some things that they necessarily want to participate very actively in themselves. But I would say, why would somebody suggest that others shouldn't have a similar opportunity? But I think, as you said, these are really excellent opportunities to do a bit of education. And I think that quite often, it's people who are largely included as of right, if you like, people who might be variously, white, abled, heterosexual, cisgender, male, not worried where the next meal is coming from, not worried about keeping the roof over their heads, people who've always had UK citizenship, those kinds of things. Sometimes don't realise that those things that they can take for, there are things that they can take for granted because of those factors that can't be taken for granted by other people, and that there needs to be some recognition of that, some kind of visibilizing, some moments where actually there is a little bit more impetus behind saying, well, actually, this is not the same for other people. Let's see what we can do to do better, to put that bit of effort in to help ensure that other people can enjoy the same kind of rights, the same decent standard of living, safety, all of those sorts of things. I think sometimes people genuinely just don't get why it's important. And I think also sometimes people might not like to be reminded that perhaps they, we all hold at times privileges in certain ways that others don't have. But in essence, why wouldn't we want to do something that's positive, that seeks to help others, and that may be a bit celebratory at times as well?
And it's giving it visibility, isn't it? Because, it's like you're saying, inclusion should be for everyone. And we do know, and there's been reports historically where I think Stonewall have done, where people don't feel they can be out, whether if they're trans, they don't feel they can be themselves. They sadly, I used to work for an organisation that supported a lot of people who were victims of crime. And a lot of people have challenges around transphobia, it's still there. So though we need to, those messages need to be shared so people know. That's why, for example, Trans Day of Remembrance is really important, because people need to know about the challenges. To people who don't know about Trans Day of Remembrance, it's coming up soon, isn't it? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, it's the 20th November each year, and it is just a moment to recognise the trans people who have lost their lives across the world during the course of that year, essentially through transphobias. That may be through being murdered, that may be through taking their own lives, through suicide. So I think that is something to acknowledge and recognise. I think that when we lose people, that are then gone forever, we've lost something really important from the world and the things that they bring. So yes, that's what Trans Day of Remembrance is about. It's for trans folks to come together and just recognise people that we may know directly, people that we may know of who've maybe been important to the community, and people that perhaps we've never heard of, that were just trying to live their lives. But it's also part of the wider Trans Awareness Week, and so there can be more positivity in some of the other aspects of the week, and also Trans Day of Visibility at other times. So I think it is balancing that remembrance and using that as a springboard and impetus to say, well, actually, this sort of thing isn't okay. It shouldn't be continuing. We should be taking actions to stop that, as we should for all communities that are suffering or struggling in those kinds of ways. And at the same time, countering that with not a continual victim narrative about trans people. Many of us live happy and fulfilled and positive lives, and those are the things to be celebrated. We just need to make sure that's kind of the case and the opportunity for everybody, not just for some.
Yeah, definitely. And, one thing, and I know you'd find the same thing, or you may see the same thing as some organisations where I've sort of alluded to it earlier on. So it was just really if anything else you want to add about the tick box. Like we mentioned just now that it's really important to promote all of those awareness months and events because one, it raises awareness. Secondly, you might talk about the challenges, but also talk about the good stuff, the positives around the trans community. And sometimes people will think, "Oh, I've just done that. I've done Trans Remembrance. I've done Trans Awareness Week," and think I'm done. And then for the rest of the year, or maybe do a little bit in LGBT History Month, for example. What about, and sadly, we've talked about performative, actions or lack of actions, should I say, when it's performative. But what would you say to people about, or employers or people in organisations even about truly embedding trans inclusion?
Yeah. I think, to be honest, I think that there are relatively few places that really cynically play the tick box game. I think most people are kind, decent people who don't willingly hurt other people, who will put in at least a little bit of effort to help others. But I think what I do see is a lot of organisations that start with good intentions and then it kind of falls by the wayside. Other stuff takes over. It ends up being deprioritised. So they don't start out intending to do it in that sort of tick boxy way, but it sort of ends up that way because they haven't followed through. And I think, as you were saying, as with all things, it needs to be a year-round activity. So why not take one of those moments, whether that's LGBT History Month or Pride Month or Trans Awareness Week, and actually write your year's plan for what you're going to do. What are you going to do on a monthly basis? What are you going to do on a quarterly basis that will help you step forwards so that in a year's time, you're not in the same place, you're actually in a different place, in a more inclusive place. So I think, and I think you could ask yourself that on an individual basis as well. What have I done this month or this quarter, even if it's something small? So it could be signing up to a good newsletter that arrives maybe on a weekly or a monthly basis, and at least take the time to skim it. So you've got some kind of an idea of what issues the community might be facing and the kinds of things that might help. Those kinds of newsletters often contain the odd call to action around things, responding to a consultation, maybe signing an open letter, those sorts of things. So again, it's all gives you those little opportunities where you can step up and make a difference and show that allyship. And I think the other thing is being ready to hold a line as well. We've seen a number of organisations, for example, put trans or non-binary people into adverts, then pull the advert and fail to support people when they get trolled online. That is very much going to be perceived as performative. And that is the kind of thing that will lose you followers. In many ways, stepping up and then stepping back the moment you get a bit of a challenge and the moment it gets a little bit hard is even worse kind of than not stepping up in the first place. Although we do want people to step up in the first place, but do that in that sort of positive and prepared kind of way.
Yeah. No, and agree with a lot of things you said, particularly about the fact that they sometimes people don't do any more because they're not quite sure what to do next. Or, things happen. And like you say, it's not often intentional. Some are, I would say to you, I've worked with organisations where, you think, no, we're not for us because you're really not doing that, for the right reasons. But you're right, a lot of people, things that happen that they don't get there, and they don't manage to. But also the thing what you mentioned about support and is so key. So, if you're a manager out there or a friend of somebody who there's things going on, like I said, throughout the Olympics or other things that happen throughout the year, outspoken people who are anti-trans, check in on people. Are they okay? Are they okay? Are they feeling okay? Do they need any support? Because that is a major thing. And sometimes people will say to me, "Oh, I was too scared to ask." And I'm like, would you ask if it was something to do with a different issue? You should have been like, and I said, I bet you would, wouldn't you? So just because it's a challenging issue for you, you need to still ask that question. Are they okay? And sometimes people don't want to. And I think that if there's something going on, they could have staff not wanting to come into work, not wanting to travel into work, whatever. We should be checking that they're okay with that as well, which I think sometimes, I say this probably in every podcast in one way or another, fight the fear and do it anyway, because if we're all, there's that statement, I don't know who Common says it now, if we're all sitting there and let it happen, we're all part of the problem, so, we need to make sure we're all doing something as well, not just letting others do the whole, bystander effect, where I thought somebody else was going to do it. We should all be doing it.
Really, really good point, Tash. Very good point. That sort of checking in around people. And I think another thing which kind of connects quite a few of these things is that, and that we haven't really kind of spoken about in the podcast so far, is that you do want trans and non-binary people within your organisation to be involved, or at least to be able to be involved, to have a say and to step forwards. If you're creating policy, you want to hear those voices. What is it really like to be trans and non-binary in this organisation? What are the issues? What's going well? What can we embed? What should we address? But so often people are expected to do that, and not only the emotional labour, but the actual doing of the writing of the policy and things like that for free. And so I think one of the most important things that could be done is that if you do have people who are willing to step up and do some of that work, and we shouldn't assume or burden anybody in that way. We shouldn't be, we should be supportive and listening rather than extractive. But I think that just making sure that there is some paid time to do that is really, really important as well. And that's a particular, standing up as an ally and fighting to get that paid time is a really important and material thing. And I think it can help enormously. And also these things are an iterative process. I mean, we often, it's probably that you find the same kind of thing, is that if you have an organisation that is working up its first policy, for example, perhaps people who that policy might be a little bit more about or for are reticent to step forwards. Because they're unsure, because there isn't already a policy, they're not necessarily feeling perhaps quite safe or how things are going to go. And so an organisation like ours can help bridge that gap a little bit, because we're often for the community. So we tend to be quite, if people know about us, they tend to trust us. And say, okay, well, if gendered intelligence is involved, that's okay. And then gradually, as that starts to roll, then people will become more involved. And the next time you do an iteration of your policy, you'll probably have more people being more outspoken, people feeding in more. And it is that iterative thing over a number of policy cycles, I think.
Yeah, and it's definitely and I know you do exactly the same thing. It's all about ongoing communications. What messages are you saying to people in your organisation, whatever it is about trans inclusion? Are you saying we're supportive? Are you saying this is here for you? Are you saying we want to listen to you? That needs to be ongoing, not just when it's those, like, we talked about earlier about the awareness event. And so it's really important that there's ongoing comms around it, not just a once or twice a year. And you mentioned earlier about listening to your, trans and non-binary staff, and that's so important, whether it's volunteers or all staff, actually, because a lot of people work with volunteers, don't they? And also doing something with it, not being frightened. And like, we do a lot of listening groups, and I'm sure you do the same in terms of listening to people. And, making sure that once it's fed back to you, what is happening, what the feeling is, what support. Don't dilly-dally people, because that makes people, they've listened to you and they're not doing anything about it because they might find it hard. Make sure you're willing to do the action part. And I think sometimes, again, you can even get somebody to help you who gave that feedback. Please do. Anything else that we haven't touched on, you feel you want to share, Simon, that we haven't managed to talk about today, or anything else you want to add?
Well, I could chat all day. That would be lovely, and bring more examples and all of those sorts of things. But no, I think that's been really good. It's felt like quite a wide ranging conversation, and it's touched on some really important points there about what employers particularly can do, and service providers to start to think about being more inclusive in that regard. So yeah, that's been brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, and just a reminder of people how to get hold of you, and also any of the resources that are available. So go for it, Simon.
Okay, so please do visit the Gendered Intelligence website. That is at www.gendered, so there's an ED on the end of gender, genderedintelligence.co.uk. There's plenty of information there. By all means, you can get in contact with me. I am simon.croft at genderedintelligence.co.uk. You can also find me on LinkedIn. If you find the one which has got the picture of me looking like this, you probably found the right work profile. There's one of me looking about 15 years younger, which is my art profile, which I've just failed to update. So ignore that one, but find the right one. And please do connect with me on LinkedIn. And then if there's something that you need and you can't find it on our website, or you're not sure if we can help, then get in touch. Of course, if we can help, we'll tell you. If we can't help, we'll tell you that as well and try and signpost you to somewhere that can. And we've got loads of resources there on our website. In particular, we've got a huge free to download trans inclusion resource list for professionals. It started off as about half a dozen links to follow up on one of our early training sessions, and it's now around about 40 odd pages. It includes a whole range of organizations that you can contact for help, loads and loads of free to download guidance and support documents, which are virtually all written from the point of view of professionals looking to improve their employment circumstance or their service delivery. And then we've also got a load of reports as well. So if you're looking for information, data, all of that kind of thing, there's a lot there. It's all segmented with lots of different headings and things. So whilst it's a huge document, you should be able to find what you need pretty easily. So we've got that. As I mentioned, we've got all sorts of other stuff, the training. We've got the free toolkit. We've got free sports documents online. Loads of stuff there. So do go and have a look. As I said, if you can't find what you need, give us a shout.
All right, thank you. Brilliant, Simon. And I always say that, get people to have the resources, because like you say, education, knowledge is power. So if people can know a little bit more, educate yourself a little bit more, that's the first step. So hopefully people have found this a useful introduction into trans inclusion. Hopefully they will go away and learn more. And I always say to people, as well as the brilliant resources that you've got, even if you go on all the sort of, not social media, the sort of, whether it's Netflix, iPlayer, and all those sort of things, there is always lived experience, more learning that we could do, because the more we know, we're going to reduce that, those biases, that misunderstanding, and realise that there is a lot of misinformation out there. So hopefully people have really found value in Simon speaking to us from Gender Intelligence. And Simon, thank you very much for your time. Until next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Please do spread the word about our channel and tune in for our next episode.